The wind had a bite to it that promised worse to come. It swept down from the north, a dry, ceaseless thing that flattened the tall prairie grass and carried the scent of dust and distant snow. Elias Boone felt it on the back of his neck, a familiar chill that had little to do with the late autumn air. It was the cold of a quiet house, of a table set for one. He pulled the collar of his worn sheepskin coat tighter, his gaze scanning the endless line of his fence. 60 acres. It had once felt like a kingdom. Now it was just a patch of dirt he was tethered to, a place haunted by the ghosts of laughter. His horse, a steady buckskin named Buck, plodded along the perimeter, hooves making a soft, rhythmic thud against the hard-packed earth. This was the routine. Ride the fence, check for breaks, fix what needed fixing. It was work that filled the hours, that kept his hands busy and his mind just quiet enough not to scream. A year. It was nearly a year since the fever had taken Sarah and little Daniel, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. He was nearing the southern edge of his property, where the land dipped down toward the hollow that held the old Barlow place. The Barlows had given up 2 years back, beat by drought and debt. The bank owned it now, which meant nobody owned it. The cabin stood empty, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the valley. That's when he saw it. Not a flame, but a smudge against the pale gray sky. A lazy, sputtering column of smoke, thick and dirty white. It wasn't the clean, confident smoke of a man who knew his business. It was the smoke of wet wood, of desperation. The kind of smoke that said a fool was trying to burn green cottonwood to keep from freezing. Elias stopped Buck, his hand resting on the saddle horn. His first instinct was a familiar one: turn around. Not his land, not his problem. The world was full of fools, and he had no appetite for adding to his own troubles. But the smoke didn't stop. It billowed and coiled, a pathetic signal of distress in the vast emptiness. He thought of Daniel, how his own son had shivered with that fever despite the roaring fire Elias had kept in the hearth. He pictured someone small, huddled by a fire that gave more smoke than heat, with a low curse meant for himself. He nudged Buck forward, down the gentle slope toward the abandoned homestead. He didn't draw the colt on his hip, but he kept his hand near it. The frontier didn't reward carelessness. As he got closer, he could smell the acrid scent of the struggling fire. The Barlow cabin was a sorry sight, its porch sagging and a few shingles missing from the roof. But someone had tried to patch one of the broken windows with a piece of burlap. A woman was there, kneeling by a crude fire pit a few yards from the cabin door. She was thin, her dress faded and patched, a threadbare shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Her back was to him. Beside her, a small boy, no older than 7, was feeding twigs into the sputtering, hissing flames. The boy's coat was too small for him, the sleeves ending well above his bony wrists. Elias reined Buck in about 20 yards away, letting the horse's presence announce him. The woman spun around, her body instantly tense. She snatched the boy behind her, one hand on his shoulder, her eyes wide and wary. She looked like a cornered doe, ready to bolt but with nowhere to run. "Ma'am," Elias said, his voice raspy from disuse. He kept his hands in plain sight, one on the reins, the other on his saddle horn. "We ain't bothering no one," she said, her voice low but clear. "Just resting for a spell." "That wood's too green," Elias said, nodding toward the smoking pile. "It'll choke you out before it warms you. There's a dead oak fell over on the north side of the creek bed, about a quarter mile that way." He pointed with his chin. "Burns, hot and clean. You got an axe?" Her eyes narrowed, searching his face for a trick, for a threat. He saw the pride in her, as brittle and sharp as a shard of glass. He saw the exhaustion underneath it. "I can manage," she said stiffly. The boy peeked out from behind her skirts. He had large, solemn eyes that took in everything: the man, the horse, the rifle in its scabbard. Elias felt a familiar pang in his chest, a dull ache that never truly went away. He looked just like Daniel, just for a second. "Name's Elias Boone," he said, deciding that was enough. "I live on the next spread over." He didn't offer her his hand, and she didn't offer her name. It was a transaction of information, nothing more. He could see the struggle in her face. The cold was a real and present enemy, and her pride was a poor shield against it. "Abigail Whitlow," she said at last. The words clipped. "This is my son, Finn. We're obliged for the information." He gave a curt nod. "Winter's coming on fast. This valley gets more snow than you'd think." It was a warning, but a gentle one. He turned buck, ready to ride away, to put the wall of solitude back up around himself. He'd done his part. He'd offered a piece of practical advice. He didn't owe these people anything. "You the law around here?" she called out, a hint of challenge in her voice. Elias stopped and looked back over his shoulder. "No, ma'am. Just a farmer. The bank owns this land now. They don't send anyone out much, but they don't like squatters." "We're not squatters," she insisted, her chin high. "We're travelers. My husband, he passed. We're heading on to join my kin in Oregon." The story sounded rehearsed, thin as her shawl. Oregon was a long way off, and this wasn't the time of year to be starting the journey, but it wasn't his place to call her a liar. He just nodded again. "Good luck to you, then." He rode off, the feeling of the boy's eyes on his back. He didn't look back again. It wasn't his business. He repeated the words to himself all the way back to his cabin, the wind whipping them away as soon as he thought them. For 3 days, he tried to put the woman and her boy out of his mind. He mended the harness for his plow horse. He patched a hole in his own roof. He sat by his fire at night and read the same passages in his Bible over and over, the words failing to offer their usual comfort. But every time he stepped outside, he found himself looking south, toward the Barlow place. He saw the smoke now, a thin, steady plume of gray. She'd found the oak. Good. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. He thought of the boy's thin wrists. He remembered the look in Abigail Whitlow's eyes, not just fear, but a fierce, bone-deep resolve that he recognized. It was the look of a survivor. He was a survivor, too. He knew what it cost. On the 4th day, the sky was the color of lead, and the wind carried the first sharp needles of ice. A real storm was coming. He was checking on his small herd of cattle when he saw the riders. 3 of them, heading up the valley from the direction of town. He recognized the man in the lead instantly. Clay Maddox. Maddox worked for the Double Bar, the biggest ranch in the county, and he wore his authority like a cheap suit, too tight and prone to splitting at the seams. He was a bully who enjoyed making other people feel small. Elias moved back toward the cover of a small stand of aspens, watching. The riders didn't head for his place. They cut straight across the valley toward the Barlow homestead. They didn't ride fast, but with a slow, deliberate purpose that made the hair on Elias's arms stand up. They circled the cabin once, their horses trampling the sparse yard. Elias couldn't hear what they said, but he could see Maddox gesture widely, taking in the whole property, then pointing down the trail that led out of the valley. He saw Abigail standing in the doorway, the small shape of her son behind her. She didn't move, didn't cower. She just stood there, a lone, defiant figure. After a few minutes, Maddox seemed to laugh. He tipped his hat in a mock salute, and the 3 of them trotted off, leaving a palpable sense of menace in their wake. Elias stayed hidden until they were long gone. He watched the cabin for a long time. The door remained closed. He imagined the woman inside, her mind racing. Maddox hadn't done anything, not yet, but he had delivered a message. "You don't belong here. Get out." The town, Elias knew, had a long memory for transgressions and a short one for charity. A single woman with a child, living on abandoned land, would be grist for the gossip mill, and men like Maddox fed on that kind of talk. He turned to buck and rode for home, a cold fury simmering in his gut. It was one thing to fight the wind and the snow. It was another thing entirely to fight the meanness of men. He had wanted nothing more than to be left alone with his grief, to live out his days in the quiet hum of his own work. He had no desire to be a hero, no wish to get entangled in the messy lives of others. Sarah and Daniel had taken all the fight out of him. But as he unsaddled Buck in the barn, the scent of hay and leather filling the air, he saw the image of Finn's face again. He saw the defiance in Abigail's posture as she faced down 3 armed men. They were trying to survive, same as him, and survival on the prairie was hard enough without predators circling. He strode into his cabin and went to the larder. He pulled out a sack of dried beans and a slab of cured bacon. It wasn't much, but it was more than they had. He hesitated. This was charity. She would refuse it. Her pride wouldn't let her take it. He needed a different way, a way that let her keep her dignity intact. He looked around his small, orderly cabin. The fence still needed another day's work. The barn door had a broken hinge. There was always work to be done. An idea began to form. A simple agreement. Not charity, a job. Labor in exchange for food. A fair trade. It was a language people on the frontier understood. It was a way of offering a hand without making the other person feel like a beggar. He looked out the window. The sun was setting, painting the bruised sky in shades of orange and purple. A single light flickered to life in the window of the distant Barlow cabin. A small, stubborn pinprick of light against the encroaching darkness. Elias let out a long breath. He felt it then, a heavy, unwelcome certainty. He was going to walk back down that hill tomorrow. He was going to knock on that door. The quiet solitude he had so carefully constructed around himself was about to be broken. He had just stepped, knowingly and irrevocably, into somebody else's trouble. The weight of it settled onto his shoulders, feeling as real and as cold as the coming winter snow. He waited 2 days, not 3. The approaching storm wouldn't allow for more. He loaded Buck not with charity, but with tools. A good crosscut saw, a heavy splitting maul, a canvas bag heavy with nails, and his spare axe. Only then did he add the sacks of beans and flour and the wrapped slab of bacon. They were payment, not a gift. That distinction felt important, a bedrock on which a respectable thing could be built. He rode over in the gray light of dawn, the air sharp and still. When he arrived, Abigail was outside, a bucket in each hand, heading for the creek. She stopped dead when she saw him, her posture instantly defensive. Finn, who had been trying to rig a small trap by the cabin steps, scrambled to his mother's side. Elias dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. "Mornin', missus. Wit low." He didn't wait for a reply, but began unstrapping the tools from Buck's saddle. "Got a proposition for you." He set the saw and the maul on the ground. "My south fence needs mending before the snow sets in for good. It's more work than one man can rightly manage in time. I figure 2 people could get it done." She watched him, her eyes unreadable. She said nothing. "I'd pay for the labor, of course." He continued, gesturing to the sacks he was now lifting down. "A week's work for a week's supplies. More. If the work takes longer, it's a fair wage." She looked from the food to the tools, then back to his face. He saw the calculation in her eyes, the weighing of pride against the gnawing reality of an empty belly and a growing boy. He remembered Sarah, how she'd insisted on churning extra butter to trade for the things they couldn't grow or make. "Never take what you haven't earned, Elias," she used to say. "It puts you in a debt you can't see." He wasn't trying to put this woman in his debt. He was trying to offer her a way out of it. Abigail was different from Sarah, quieter, with a harder edge born of different trials, but he saw the same stubborn core of self-reliance. He wasn't looking to replace his wife's memory. He was trying to honor it by respecting that same quality in another. "I don't know nothing about fencin'," Abigail said flatly. "I can teach you," he said. "The boy, too. It's good for a boy to know how to use his hands." He looked at Finn, who peered back with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Work is work. Honest work is never a thing to be ashamed of. She was silent for a long moment, the wind whipping a loose strand of her brown hair across her face. "The food first," she said, her voice low. "My boy is hungry." "That's fair," Elias agreed. He carried the sacks to her doorstep. She didn't thank him, just gave a stiff nod as she ushered Finn inside. It wasn't gratitude he wanted. It was acceptance of the terms. They started on the deadfall oak. The wood was seasoned and hard as iron. Elias showed her how to use the crosscut saw, one person on each end, pulling and releasing in a steady rhythm. At first, their movements were jerky, the blade binding in the wood. But Abigail was a quick study. She learned to feel the saw's motion, to pull smoothly, not forcing it. Soon, the rhythmic rasp of steel on wood became a steady, shared breath. They didn't talk much. The work was the conversation. Finn, seeing them work, wanted to help. Elias found a smaller branch and showed the boy how to hold the spare axe, how to let its weight do the work, chopping off smaller limbs for kindling. The boy was clumsy but determined, his small face screwed up in concentration. He swung the axe and missed the branch, the blade glancing off and scratching his hand against the rough bark. He let out a sharp cry, more from surprise than pain. Abigail was there in an instant, dropping her end of the saw. She knelt and examined his hand, a long, shallow scrape that was already welling with blood. "It's nothing. Finn, you're all right," she said, her voice soft with a tenderness Elias hadn't heard before. "Hold on," Elias said. He went to his saddlebags and pulled out a clean strip of cotton cloth and the small flask of whiskey he kept for emergencies. He poured a little on the cloth, ignoring Abigail's sharp, questioning look. "It'll sting, but it'll clean it out," he told Finn, his voice gentle. The boy flinched and squeezed his eyes shut as Elias dabbed the cut, but he didn't cry out again. As Abigail was wrapping the cloth around Finn's hand, a buggy appeared on the trail from town. It was Dr. Ada Mercer, a woman whose competence and independence were a quiet scandal in the county. She was a widow herself, but one with a medical degree from back east, and she tolerated no nonsense from anyone. She pulled her horse to a halt. "Trouble, Doctor?" Mercer asked, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. "Just a scratch, Ada," Elias said. The doctor stepped down from her buggy, carrying her black bag. "Let me be the judge of that." She knelt beside Finn, her movements efficient and calming. She unwrapped the makeshift bandage, cleaned the wound properly with something from her bag, and applied a neat, professional dressing. "You'll live, young man," she told Finn with a small smile, "but perhaps stick to smaller sticks for a while." She stood and looked at Abigail. "I'll put a bottle of carbolic salve on your account. Mrs. Whitlow." "We have no account," Abigail said, her back stiffening. "Doctor," Mercer's smile didn't waver. "You do now. My fees are payable when they're able. A smile from a brave patient counts as a down payment." She gave Finn a wink, then turned her gaze to Elias. It was a knowing look, but not a judgmental one. "Good to see you helping your new neighbors. Elias." She climbed back into her buggy and, with a flick of the reins, was gone. The unspoken word hung in the air. Neighbors. They went back to work, the incident creating a small, unspoken shift in the dynamic between them. They worked through the day, sawing the oak into manageable lengths, then splitting them with a maul. Elias taught Abigail how to read the grain, where to place the wedge, how to strike clean and true. Her arms grew tired, but she never complained. She just set her jaw and kept swinging. By late afternoon, they had a respectable pile of firewood stacked by her cabin door. That's when Clay Maddox returned. He wasn't alone this time either. The same two men were with him, reining in their horses just beyond the fire pit, positioning themselves as if to block the path back to Elias's property. "Well now, Boone," Maddox drawled, a smirk on his face. "Didn't figure you for the charitable type. Taking in strays. Elias set the maul down carefully, placing himself between Maddox and the cabin where Abigail had just taken Finn. "This is a work arrangement. Maddox, it's got nothing to do with you." "Anything that happens in this valley has to do with me," Maddox said, his voice hardening. "And the good people of this town, they don't take kindly to vagrants setting up house on bank property. Makes things look untidy." He spat a stream of tobacco juice near Elias's boot. "We have an arrangement," Abigail said, stepping out of the cabin. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the fear Elias knew she must be feeling. Maddox laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "An arrangement with who the coyotes? This ain't your land, ma'am?" "I have a lease agreement," she said, her words clear and precise. "A temporary tenant's lease filed with Mr. Garrett at the bank in town. We're to act as caretakers, to keep the property from falling into ruin, in exchange for shelter." Elias stared at her. It was a brilliant bluff. Garrett was a stickler for paperwork, but he was also a fair man who disliked bullies. Maddox would have to ride all the way to town and challenge the banker to his face to call her on it. And Maddox didn't have that kind of courage. Maddox's smirk faltered. He looked from her to Elias, searching for a crack. "Garrett never mentioned nothing to me. Perhaps Mr. Garrett doesn't feel the need to report his business to a ranch hand," Abigail said, her tone icy. Before Maddox could reply, Elias took a half-step forward. "Mrs. Whitlow is working for me to repair my fence line," he said, his voice low and even. "I've vouched for her. Her honor is sound. If you have a problem with her presence here, you'll have to take it up with me and with Mr. Garrett." The challenge was laid bare. Maddox looked at Elias's calm stance, at the Colt holstered on his hip, at the quiet determination in his eyes. He looked back at his two companions, who suddenly seemed very interested in the horizon. The fight went out of him. "This ain't over," he muttered, but it was a child's threat. He wheeled his horse around, and the three of them galloped away, kicking up dust. A long silence settled over the small yard. The only sounds were the wind and the distant cry of a hawk. "Thank you," Abigail said quietly, not looking at him. "You're a fast thinker," Elias replied, picking up the maul. "Mr. Garrett's bank, eh?" "A woman alone has to be," she said. She turned and went back inside. They spent the rest of the daylight hours patching the cabin. Elias showed her how to measure and saw the planks he'd scavenged from the Barlow's collapsed woodshed. They worked together, covering the hole in the wall and nailing new shingles over the worst of the leaks in the roof. Their hands sometimes brushed as they passed a hammer or a handful of nails. Each time, a small jolt passed between them, an awareness that was new and unsettling. As dusk began to settle, Abigail brought out a piece of paper and a small nub of a pencil. "We should keep a tally," she said, her voice all business, "of the hours worked and the supplies advanced. So it's all square." Elias watched as she wrote. Her hand moved with a fluid grace that surprised him. The letters she formed were elegant, precise, with the practiced flourish of a clerk or a bookkeeper. It was the script of an educated person, not a drifter's wife. Another piece of her story that didn't quite fit. He looked at the neat columns she was drawing. Her head bent in concentration. They had faced down a threat together. They had worked, side by side, to build something, to mend what was broken. The planks they'd nailed over the holes in the cabin wall felt like something more. It felt like they were patching up a small corner of the world, creating a fragile pocket of safety against the encroaching cold. Kindness, he realized, wasn't enough. It had to be framed with respect, with fairness. Their work arrangement was that frame. It was a deal made not of words, but of shared labor. A silent pact that allowed them both to keep their dignity, even as they leaned on one another to survive. The days of working together fell into a rough-hewn rhythm. They spoke little, but a language of shared tasks grew between them. The rasp of the saw, the thud of the maul, the metallic ring of a hammer striking a nail. These were their conversations. Elias found himself watching Abigail when she didn't know it. He saw the way she pushed a stray lock of hair from her face with a dusty forearm, the straight line of her back as she lifted a heavy plank, the quiet intensity in her eyes as she learned a new skill. The grief for Sarah was a constant, a dull ache behind his ribs. But this new awareness was something different. It was a flicker of life in a house he had thought would be dark forever. The confrontation came at dusk, just as he was banking the fire in his own cabin for the night. The sound of multiple horses approaching brought him to the door, his hand resting on the frame, his body blocking the warm light from spilling out. It was Maddox, and he'd brought 4 men with him this time. They sat their horses in a loose semicircle in Elias's yard, their figures stark silhouettes against the dying light. They weren't here for a friendly visit. "Evening, Boone," Maddox said. His tone was deceptively casual, but his eyes were hard. "Just making the rounds, checking on our neighbors." "You're a long way from the double bar," Elias said, his voice flat. He didn't move from the doorway. "Word gets around," Maddox continued, ignoring the comment. "Folks are talking, saying you've taken a shine to that squatter down in the hollow. Folks are wondering if you've forgotten how this valley works. We like things orderly." One of the other men chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "What Abigail Whitlow does is her own concern," Elias said, "and what I do on my own time is mine." "See, that's where you're wrong." Maddox leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping. "When a man like you starts vouching for trash, it reflects on all of us. It brings down the whole neighborhood. We're here to give you some friendly advice. Stay clear of her. Let things take their natural course." "And what course is that?" Elias asked, though he already knew the answer. Maddox shrugged, a theatrical gesture of indifference. "Things happen. It's getting cold. Fires start easy in these old, dry cabins. A real shame if a widow and her boy were to get displaced, especially with a storm coming." The threat was unmistakable now, laid bare in the cold evening air. Elias's own anger was a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He thought of the fire that had taken his own barn 2 years ago, a lightning strike, they'd said, but he'd always had his doubts. He knew the kind of casual cruelty men like Maddox were capable of. He took a slow breath, letting his gaze pass over each of the 5 riders. "You listen to me, Maddox," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "That cabin is on bank property. You set one spark to it, and that's arson. That's Sheriff Banks's business. And the sheriff, he knows me. He knows I'm a man who keeps his word." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "And Kansas law is mighty clear about what a man is allowed to do to protect a home, and the people sheltered in it. You come near her or that boy, you're not just dealing with the law. You're dealing with me." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The promise was plain. Maddox held his gaze for a long moment. Then a sneer twisted his lips. He hadn't gotten the fear he'd come for. "You're a fool, Boone. You're choosing the wrong side." He yanked on his reins, turning his horse sharply. "Let's ride." He spat at his men. They galloped out of his yard, their hoofbeats fading into the growing dark. Elias stood in the doorway for a long time, the cold seeping into his bones. The threat wasn't idle. Maddox had been publicly defied, and his pride would demand satisfaction. They wouldn't come tonight. They'd wait. They'd let the fear simmer. They would come for Abigail and the boy tomorrow. He didn't hesitate. He slammed his cabin door, grabbed his heavy coat and his rifle, and strode to the barn. He saddled Buck with a numb, efficient hands. The first flakes of snow were beginning to drift down from the iron-gray sky, melting as they touched the ground. The wind was rising, moaning through the eaves of the barn. He thought of his wife and son, buried on the hill behind the cabin. He had failed to protect them from a fever. He would not fail to protect these 2 from the wickedness of men. The fear of loss was a familiar ghost. but the thought of standing by and doing nothing was a horror he couldn't face. The ride through the darkness was a battle against the wind. The snow was coming faster now, small, stinging pellets that whipped against his face. The trail was barely visible, a faint gray ribbon in the moonlight that was trying and failing to break through the thick clouds. He urged Buck on, the horse's warm breath pluming in the frigid air. When he saw the faint, flickering light from the Barlow cabin, a profound sense of relief washed over him. He dismounted before he reached the yard, not wanting the sound of his horse to frighten her. He tied Buck to a low-hanging branch and walked the last 100 yards, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He knocked on the rough plank door. There was a long silence. Then the sound of a bar being lifted. The door opened a crack. Abigail stood there, holding a lantern high, her face pale and taut in its glow. Finn was huddled behind her, his small face etched with worry. "Maddox came to my place," he said, getting straight to the point. "He and 4 others. They made it clear they're coming for you, tomorrow." He saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, but it was quickly masked by a defiant anger. "And what do you want me to do, run again?" "I want you to come back with me, to my cabin, now." She stared at him, her expression incredulous, then harsh. "Absolutely not. Do you have any idea what you're suggesting?" "I'm suggesting you and your boy stay alive," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "They're not just going to ask you to leave this time. Abigail, they threatened to burn this place down." "And what happens after that?" she shot back, her voice a fierce whisper so as not to further scare her son. "We stay in your house, a widow and her son, living with a single man." The talk from Maddox would be a Sunday sermon compared to the gossip that would start. They would ruin us. They would call me your kept woman. They would destroy any chance Finn and I have of ever being seen as decent people. "To hell with decent people," Elias's voice rose, louder than he intended. "Decent people aren't coming out here to burn you out of your home. This is about living to see the next sunrise, not about what some biddies in town whisper over their sewing." "That whispering is a weapon?" she countered, her own voice rising to match his. "It can kill you just as dead as a fire. Just slower, it can make it so no one will hire you. No one will trade with you. No one will even look you in the eye. I will not trade a quick end for a slow one. We will not be your charity case. Mr. Boone, we will not be your burden." The argument was raw. Stripped of all politeness, they stood in the flickering lamplight, 2 stubborn souls clashing, their fears and their pride laid bare. From behind Abigail's skirts, a small, trembling voice cut through the anger. "Mama, are we still decent folk?" Finn's question hung in the air, devastating in its simplicity. Abigail's face crumpled. The fight seemed to drain out of her, replaced by a wave of crushing weariness. She knelt and pulled her son into her arms, burying her face in his hair. All the fight, Elias realized, was for the boy, to protect him, to give him a life where he could hold his head high. Elias's own anger subsided, replaced by a deep ache of empathy. "There's a way," he said, his voice softer now. "We do it right. We make it a proper arrangement. I need a hired hand to help me through the winter, someone to cook and mend and help with the chores. You and Finn need a safe place to stay. I'll pay you a wage. You'll be my employee. You'll live in the spare room. It'll be a business contract, clean and clear, something to tell the gossips when they come sniffing around." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. She was looking for pity, for a lie, for any sign that this was just a trick to make her dependent on him. But she saw only a grim, practical sincerity. He was offering her the one thing she hadn't had a choice that wasn't between 2 kinds of ruin. He was offering her a shield, one built of work and wages, a way to keep her honor while accepting his help. "A contract," she repeated, testing the word. "A contract," he affirmed. "We'll set the terms tomorrow, but we have to go now. Tonight." She looked around the small, miserable cabin. It wasn't much, but it had been theirs. She looked down at her son, his small hand clutching her dress. She took a deep, shuddering breath and then gave a single, decisive nod. "All right," she said. "We'll gather what we can carry. We leave at first light." "We leave now," Elias corrected gently. "But we'll come back for the rest at dawn, before they do." She nodded again, accepting his judgment. They had chosen, not as friends, not as anything but two survivors making a pact against the coming storm. As she turned to pack their few belongings into a worn satchel, Elias looked out into the night. The snow was falling thicker now, a white curtain descending upon the prairie, burying the trail, erasing the past, and making the path forward an uncertain journey they would have to take together. Family, he thought, wasn't always about blood. Sometimes it was about who you chose to stand with when the cold wind blows. The first 2 days in Elias's cabin were a study in careful distances. They moved around each other like wary cats, a truce of necessity holding them in a fragile orbit. The contract was their shield. In the morning, Elias would outline the day's chores: wood to be chopped, the stable to be mucked out, harnesses to be oiled. Abigail would nod, her expression neutral, and set to work with a quiet, fierce efficiency. She cooked their meals, simple fare of beans and cornbread, and they ate in a thick silence at the small wooden table. Finn, subdued by the strangeness of it all, stayed close to his mother, his large eyes following Elias's every move. The house, which had been achingly empty for so long, was now filled with a different kind of silence, one of tension and unspoken questions. On the third day, the world outside vanished. The storm they had outrun arrived with the force of a battering ram. It began not with gentle flakes, but with a furious, horizontal blast of white. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the window panes and finding every tiny crack in the cabins chinking. Within an hour, the landscape was an undifferentiated sea of churning snow. They were utterly isolated, an island of flickering lamplight in a world of white chaos. They brought the animals into the barn, fighting their way through waist-deep drifts that had appeared as if by magic. The cold was a physical thing, a creature with teeth that bit at any exposed skin. Back inside, the warmth of the stove was a blessing. Elias stoked the fire, while Abigail put a kettle on to boil, the hiss of the steam a small, domestic sound of defiance against the roaring gale. It was that evening that Finn began to cough. At first, it was a small, dry sound, but as the night wore on, it deepened, taking on a raw, croupy edge. By midnight, he was struggling for breath. Each inhalation was a thin, whistling gasp, a terrible sound that clawed at the air in the quiet cabin. His forehead was burning hot, and his small body trembled with a violent chill. Abigail sat on the edge of the small cot in the spare room, her face a mask of escalating panic. She bathed his face with a cool, damp cloth, murmuring soothing words that did nothing to ease his labored breathing. Elias stood in the doorway, a helpless giant. He knew this enemy. He had seen it before. He had watched this same feverish glaze in Sarah's eyes, heard this same fight for air in Daniel's small chest. The memory rose in him like bile, a paralyzing ghost of his own failure. "It's his lungs," Abigail whispered, her voice ragged with fear. "They're closing up." She looked at Elias, her pride stripped away, leaving only raw terror. "He needs a doctor." "The doctor is 5 miles away," Elias said, his voice grim. "In this, it might as well be 100. "Then we will lose him," she said, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. It was a statement of fact, devoid of hope. The words snapped him out of his trance. He would not stand by and watch it happen again. Not this time. "No," he said, the word a hard stone in the quiet room. "I'll go." "You can't," she protested, shaking her head. "You'll die out there. You can't even see the barn from the door." "I know the way," he said, a grim certainty settling over him. "Every dip, every tree. Buttercup knows it too. We can make it." He was already pulling on his heaviest coat. wrapping a wool scarf around his neck and face.
"It's suicide,"
she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Staying here is a death sentence for him," he countered, his voice leaving no room for argument. He looked at the small, struggling boy on the cot, and the decision was as solid and immovable as the granite hills. Love, he was learning, was not a memory to be cherished. It was an action to be taken, a risk to be run. It was a ride through a blizzard in the dead of night. He saddled Buttercup in the relative quiet of the barn, the horses warm. Steady presence, a small comfort against the screaming wind. He spoke to her in low tones, calming her as he cinched the saddle tight. When he opened the barn door, the storm hit them with a physical blow, a wall of ice and wind. For a moment, even he faltered. It was like stepping off a cliff into nothingness. He swung himself into the saddle, bent low, and gave Buttercup her head, trusting the mare's instincts as much as his own. The journey was a nightmare of frozen torment. The world was a blinding vortex of white. He couldn't see more than a few feet in front of him, navigating by memory and the feel of the land beneath the horse's hooves. The wind tore at him, seeking to rip him from the saddle. Ice crusted on his eyelashes, his beard, his coat, until he felt he was becoming a statue of ice himself. The cold was a deep, invasive thing, sinking past his layers of wool and sheepskin, trying to find his bones, trying to stop his heart. He thought of Finn's whistling breaths, and he pushed on. He thought of Daniel's last, shallow sigh, and he pushed harder, his own grief a desperate fuel against the cold. When the faint, muffled lights of town finally appeared through the swirling snow, he nearly wept with relief. Dr. Mercer's house was dark, but he hammered on the door until a light appeared in an upstairs window. A few moments later, the door opened. Ada stood there in her nightdress and robe, a lamp held high.
"Elias, for God's sake, get in here,"
she said, pulling him inside. "It's the boy," he gasped, his words slurring from the cold, his jaw nearly frozen shut.
"Finn, a fever. He can't breathe."
She wasted no time on questions. She was already at her medical cabinet, her movements swift and sure. She handed him a small, dark bottle. "Ipecac syrup to loosen his chest, and this," she added, giving him a packet of white powder. "Quinine for the fever. A small dose in water every 4 hours. Keep him warm. Lots of steam. Boil water in the room." She looked at his frozen state, his clothes stiff with ice.
"You're half dead yourself, Elias."
"I have to get back," he said, turning for the door.
"Wait."
She pressed a small metal flask into his hand.
"Brandy. For you. Not the horse. Don't be a fool and freeze to death on the way back."
The ride home was even worse. The cold had sunk deeper into him, and his body was racked with shivers he couldn't control. He clung to the saddle, the precious bottle of medicine tucked safely inside his coat, the only thought in his mind to keep moving forward. He let Buttercup guide them, the faithful mare plunging through drifts with a steadfast, enduring strength. When he finally stumbled into his own barn, he could barely move. He managed to unsaddle the horse, rubbing her down as best he could with shaking hands. He staggered to the cabin, pushing the door open to a blast of warm, steamy air. Abigail was there in an instant, helping him out of his frozen coat, her face pale with worry.
"I thought you were gone."
She whispered. "The medicine," he managed to say, pulling the bottle from his coat. Their long vigil began. They moved to the kitchen, the warmest room in the house, laying Finn on a pallet of blankets near the hearth. Abigail followed Ada's instructions, forcing a few drops of the dark syrup into Finn, who whimpered and coughed. Elias kept a great pot of water boiling on the stove, filling the small room with a thick, life-giving steam that condensed on the cold window panes, blurring the raging storm outside into a formless white oblivion. They worked together in near silence, a team forged in crisis. He kept the fire roaring, the wood box full. She bathed Finn's face, changed his damp bedding, and murmured a constant stream of soft, comforting words. Hours bled into one another. They measured time by the boy's ragged breaths and the doses of quinine. Elias thawed but exhausted, sat in a chair by the fire, watching her. He saw a strength in her he hadn't fully appreciated, a mother's fierce, relentless love. In a quiet moment, as Finn slept a fitful, shallow sleep, she sat at the table, her hands trembling. "I was wrong," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I thought being alone was the safest way. I thought relying on anyone was a weakness." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a raw, unguarded gratitude. To depend on the right person, that's not weakness, that's a lifeline. He just nodded, too tired for words. A little later, to keep her hands busy, she took out the nub of pencil and the paper she used for her ledger. She began to write, not words, but columns of figures, a habit to calm her mind. Elias noticed how quickly her pencil moved, adding, subtracting, calculating. "You're good with numbers," he observed quietly. She gave a small, sad smile. "I had practice. My husband, before he passed, he left debts. I was a ledger clerk for the Union Pacific Railroad for a time. Back in Omaha, it was my job to keep the accounts straight. I learned to be very precise." The confession hung in the air. Another piece of her puzzle clicking into place. It explained her educated hand, her quick mind, her bluff with Maddox. She wasn't just a drifter. She was a woman who had known a different life, a life of order and numbers. Before it had all fallen apart, it made her resilience, her fight to maintain her dignity, all the more profound. They sat in the shared, steamy warmth as the storm raged on, their separate pasts laid bare, their present fused together by the fight for the small life breathing fitfully beside them. The collaboration of their work arrangement had been burned away by the heat of the fever and frozen by the ice of the blizzard. What was left was something else entirely. It was a bond, forged in the crucible of a long, terrifying night. Just as the first pale, gray light of dawn began to seep through the steam-streaked windows, a change occurred. Finn's breathing, which had been a desperate, whistling struggle all night, deepened. The harsh, rasping sound softened, becoming a quieter, more even rhythm. Abigail pressed her hand to his forehead. The fire was gone. "The fever's broken," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. Elias came and stood beside her, looking down at the sleeping boy. The storm outside was finally beginning to subside, the wind's howl softening to a low moan. A fragile peace settled over the small cabin. The morning sun broke through the clouds, striking the new-fallen snow and reflecting a brilliant, blinding light that filled the room. It was a clean, new world, washed in silver and silence. Abigail looked up at Elias, her face streaked with soot and tears, looking more beautiful to him than he could have imagined. Her lips formed a single, trembling word that carried the weight of the entire night, of the risk and the fear and the shared hope. "Thank you." The blizzard broke, and in its wake, the world was remade in silence and blinding white. The long, hard winter locked them in, but inside the small cabin, something was thawing. The stark lines of their contract blurred and softened, eroded by the shared vigil over Finn and the quiet rhythm of survival. They no longer moved around each other with careful formality. A comfortable silence grew, punctuated by the small sounds of a life being lived together, the scrape of a spoon in a bowl, the crackle of the fire, the soft thud of Abigail's mending basket on the floor. When the Chinook winds finally came, carrying the sweet, wet scent of melting snow and damp earth, it felt like a collective exhalation. Spring arrived late, but with a fierce, green urgency. Life, held captive under the ice, surged forth. Elias felt it in his own chest, a loosening of a knot he hadn't realized was there. He and Abigail, he still called her Mrs. Whitlow in his head. But the name felt stiff and untrue, now worked from sunup to sundown. He plowed the small field beside the cabin, the rich soil turning over in dark, fragrant waves. She followed behind, breaking up the clods of earth. Her hands, like his, becoming stained with the promise of new growth. Together, they planted the hardy winter vegetables whose seeds he'd saved: potatoes, turnips, carrots, things that would last, things you could depend on. She started a small garden near the cabin door, coaxing tender shoots of lettuce and onions from the cold ground. Sometimes, as she worked, a low, gentle humming would escape her lips, a half-forgotten tune that spoke of a life before this one. Elias would hear it from the field and find himself pausing, his hand on the plow, just to listen. He took it upon himself to teach Finn the things a boy should know. He started with riding. He'd sit Finn in front of him on Buck's broad back, the boy's small hands clutching the saddle horn, his body rigid with a mixture of terror and delight. Elias's hands would rest lightly on Finn's waist, steadying him, and he'd talk in a low, even voice about the horse, about the land, about the sky. Slowly, the boy's fear gave way to a quiet confidence. They were a family in all but name. The three of them moved in a synchronized, unspoken dance. They shared meals, they shared work, they shared the small triumphs of a farm coming back to life. But they never spoke of what they were, or what they were becoming. The future was a country they had not yet dared to map. The news from town arrived with Sheriff Banks, whose horse was a familiar, welcome sight on the trail, but the sheriff's face, usually weathered into a friendly squint, was grim. "Typhoid, Elias," he said, not dismounting. "It's a bad outbreak. Started down by the tanner's place. Half a dozen people gone already. Doctor, Mercer's run off her feet. The town's under quarantine. No one in or out unless it's life or death." Elias looked toward the cabin, where Abigail had just appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. An invisible wall had just sprung up around their small patch of land, isolating them completely. "We've got enough to last," Elias said. "We'll keep to ourselves." "That's the smart thing to do," Banks agreed. He shifted in his saddle, his gaze lingering on Abigail for a moment before turning back to Elias. "There's something else. The reason I rode out. 2 men came through town yesterday. From back east, Indiana. They said, asking questions." A cold stillness fell over the yard. "They were looking for a woman," the sheriff continued, his voice low. "Named Grace Hartley," said her husband, John Hartley. Passed on owing their employer a considerable sum of money. They had a note, signed by him. They were insistent. Elias felt Abigail go rigid in the doorway. He didn't look at her, but he could feel her fear reaching across the space between them. He kept his own face a careful blank. "Never heard the name," Elias said evenly. "That's what I told them," Banks said, a flicker of something loyalty, understanding in his eyes. "Told him this is a big territory, full of folks looking for a fresh start. A woman by that name could be anywhere, or nowhere." He paused. "They're unpleasant men, Elias, the kind that look for trouble and are happy when they find it. They're staying at the saloon, waiting for the quarantine to lift. I just thought you should know." "I appreciate it, Sheriff," Elias said. Banks gave a curt nod, tipped his hat toward Abigail, and turned his horse, riding back the way he came, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in his wake. That evening, the unspoken thing between them became a chasm. They ate their dinner without a word. Finn, sensing the oppressive tension, was quiet, his eyes darting from his mother's pale, drawn face to Elias's grim expression. After Finn was put to bed in the small spare room, Elias found her on the porch. She was sitting on the top step, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring out into the deepening twilight. He sat down a few feet away, not speaking. giving her the space to find her words. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and the faint, sweet scent of the apple tree just beginning to blossom.
"My name is Grace,"
she said at last, her voice so quiet it was nearly carried away by the evening breeze.
"Grace Hartley."
Elias waited. "John, my husband, he was a good man. Once, before the gambling." The story came out in a torrent, a flood of confession held back for too long. John had been a clerk, like her, but he'd fallen in with a bad crowd. Men who ran high-stakes card games and loaned money at impossible rates. He'd lost everything. Then he'd signed a note, an indenture, really binding his labor and his family's future to these men. He died of pneumonia a month later, leaving her with an impossible debt and 2 men who saw her and her son as property to be collected.
"It wasn't a real debt,"
she whispered, her voice shaking.
"It was a chain. They didn't want the money. They wanted control. I knew I couldn't protect Finn if I stayed.
So I ran. I took what little I had, and I ran west. I changed our names. I thought if we went far enough, we could disappear. We could start over." She finally turned to look at him, her face a mess of shame and terror in the fading light. "I am not who I said I am. I brought this trouble to your door. Elias, I've put you in danger. All of it. It's been a lie." He listened to it all, the whole sorry tale. He saw not a liar, but a desperate woman fighting to save her child. He saw the same fierce, protective instinct that had driven him into the blizzard for that same child. The sins were her husband's. The consequences were her burden. He could not, would not, add his judgment to that weight. He reached out and, for the first time, took her hand. Her fingers were cold, and she flinched at his touch before her hand relaxed into his. "Your husband made his choices," Elias said, his voice rough but steady. "You made yours. You chose to protect your boy. There's no shame in that. There's no lie in that." He felt her whole body shudder with a sob she refused to let loose. The fear of losing this fragile piece, this semblance of family he had just begun to find, was a cold fist in his own gut. He had lost one family to the randomness of disease. He would not lose another to the deliberate malice of men. The cabin door creaked open behind them. Finn stood there in his nightshirt, his small figure backlit by the lamp inside. He had clearly heard the raised, urgent voices. "Mama," he asked, his voice small and frightened.
"Do we have to leave again?"
The question struck Grace harder than any threat from a stranger could. It was the voice of her greatest fear. She pulled her hand from Elias's and went to her son, scooping him up into her arms and holding him tight, burying her face in his shoulder. A week later, Elias rode into town under the cover of darkness. The quarantine was still on, but he had to get supplies, and he needed to talk to the one person he knew he could trust completely. He found Ada Mercer at her home, exhausted but resolute, a lantern burning in her surgery window. He told her everything, the whole story. Ada listened without interruption, her intelligent eyes never leaving his face. When he was finished, she was silent for a long time, tapping a finger on her desk. "The law out here is a flimsy thing, Elias," she said finally. "A piece of paper signed by a dead man in another state. It might not hold up in a real court, but men like that don't care about courts. They use the appearance of law as a club." She stood up and paced her small office. "She's vulnerable because she's alone. As a widow under the name Whitlow, she has a certain standing. But as Grace Hartley, a debtor's widow, she has none. Those men can harass her, claim guardianship of the boy as collateral. They can make her life impossible." "Then what can we do?" Elias asked, the helplessness in his own voice infuriating him. Ada stopped pacing and looked at him directly, her gaze sharp and penetrating. "You can change her legal status," she said simply. "You can give her a new name, a real one that's protected. If Grace Hartley ceased to exist, and a Mrs. Elias Boone appeared in her place, well, as your wife, she would be under your legal protection. Her husband's debts would have no claim on her. It would be a clean slate. Elias stared at her, stunned. Marriage? He hadn't thought of it. It was a practical solution to a practical problem, a legal maneuver. But as he stood there in Ada's lamp-lit office, the word echoed in the quiet chambers of his heart, and it felt like much more than that. He rode home as the sun was beginning to rise, the idea taking root in his mind. He saw his future not as a lonely plain, but as a small cabin with smoke rising from the chimney. He saw a boy learning to ride a horse, and a woman humming as she tended her garden. He saw a life, choosing to stay. To stand his ground here on this small patch of earth was no longer just about survival. It was a choice to live. It was a declaration. Ada's words echoed in Elias's mind for days, a constant, quiet hum beneath the rhythms of their work. Marriage. He had buried the word along with Sarah, locking it away in a part of his heart he never intended to revisit. But Ada hadn't spoken of romance. She had spoken of protection, of law, of a shield. It was a practical solution, a carpenter's fix for a broken world. Yet, as he watched Grace move through the days, the practical idea began to grow roots in the soil of his own quiet longing. He saw the way she spoke to Finn, her voice a low, gentle murmur. He saw the competence in her hands as she kneaded dough or mended a tear in his shirt. He saw the shadow of fear that still haunted her eyes when she looked toward the trail leading to town. He wasn't just thinking of protecting a legal entity named Grace Hartley. He was thinking of this woman, this life, this fragile piece they had built together. The quarantine held them in its grip, a strange, suspended time. The world outside, with its typhoid and its threats, was a distant rumor. Their reality was the 60 acres, the cabin, the steady turning of the days. They worked, they ate, they slept, and the space between them slowly filled with a comfortable, trusting silence. The house no longer felt like his alone. It felt like theirs. One evening, after a long day spent clearing a new patch of ground for a late planting of corn, they sat in the warm, lamp-lit kitchen. A real exhaustion had settled deep into their bones, the good ache of shared, productive labor. Finn was asleep in the small back room, his breathing soft and even. The scent of freshly baked cornbread still lingered in the air, a warm, comforting smell that spoke of home. Grace was at the dry sink, her back to him, washing the few supper dishes. Elias sat at the table, oiling a piece of harness leather, the repetitive motion of his hands a familiar comfort. The only sounds were the soft splash of water and the rhythmic squeak of the oiled cloth against the strap. "The corn will take, I think," he said into the quiet, more to hear the sound of his own voice than anything else. "The soil is rich in that bottom land." She didn't turn around. "You've worked this land a long time. You know its moods." Her voice was soft, tired. He watched the straight, proud line of her back, even in weariness. She held herself with a kind of dignity that was as essential to her as breathing. But tonight, he could sense a fragility in her posture, a slight slump in her shoulders that wasn't just from the day's work. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, heavier. "Elias," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She stopped washing, her hands still in the basin of water. "Am I a burden to you?" The question caught him off guard. He stopped his work, the oily rag held motionless in his hand. "A burden? You work as hard as I do. You've earned your keep 10 times over." "That's not what I mean." She finally turned, wiping her hands on her apron. In the warm glow of the lantern, he could see the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes, the deep-seated fear she usually kept so well hidden. "I mean all of it. The trouble, Maddox, those men from Indiana, my past. I brought a storm here, to this quiet place. If it wasn't for me and Finn, you would have your peace." She looked down at her hands, twisting the damp fabric of her apron. "Sometimes I think you took us in out of pity, a Christian duty. And now you're trapped with a woman who has a false name and a heavy past.
If I am only a weight you feel you must carry, is that a life for you?" Her words were a raw, honest confession of her deepest insecurity, that she was not a partner, but a problem, that his kindness was not a choice, but an obligation. He saw in that moment the crushing weight of shame she carried every single day. She had fought for her own survival, for her sons, but she feared the cost of that fight to others. To him, he stood up slowly and walked toward her, stopping a few feet away. He didn't rush. He let the space between them hold the weight of her question. He saw her brace herself, as if for a blow, as if expecting him to agree, to finally admit the truth of her words. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and vulnerable, her voice a fragile thread of sound. "You still want me?" He saw it all then. The frightened woman in the abandoned cabin, the fierce mother facing down armed men, the competent partner working beside him in the fields, the quiet companion sharing his hearth. He saw Grace. A small, sad smile touched his lips. He closed the remaining distance between them, his movements gentle. He could smell the clean scent of soap and the faint, womanly scent of her hair. He reached out, not to hold her, but to touch her. His calloused fingertips brushed lightly against the side of her face, a touch so soft it was barely there. She flinched, then leaned into it, her eyes closing for a brief second. "Always," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur that was for her alone. His smile widened just a little, a gentle, tender humor entering his eyes to lift the crushing solemnity of the moment. "I chose you forever," he teased, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, a silent vow that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with the woman standing before him. A shudder ran through her, a release of tension so profound it was almost a sob. She didn't pull away. She didn't speak. She just stood there, letting his touch anchor her, the simple, physical contact saying more than words ever could. It was an answer. It was an acceptance. In the quiet kitchen, with the wind whispering outside, a silent promise was made, not of protection, but of partnership. He saw her, and he chose her. The past, the danger, the trouble, he chose all of it, because it was part of her. He let his hand drop, and the spell was broken. Yet the feeling remained, a warm and steady current between them. The next morning, the world felt new. The oppressive weight of the unspoken was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty. As they sat at the table after breakfast, while Finn was outside trying to coax a squirrel down from a tree, Elias spoke. "Ada Mercer," he said, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "She said the best way to protect you, to protect Finn, is to make your name legal, to make our arrangement permanent." Grace looked at him, her expression serious, but the fear was gone from her eyes. "She meant marriage. She said it wasn't a question." "Yes," he said, "a wedding, a simple one. When the quarantine lifts, a circuit judge, a few witnesses. It would make you Mrs. Boone. It would make Finn my legal responsibility. No one could touch you." He was laying out the practical reasons, the shield Ada had spoken of. But they both knew it was more than that now. She looked down at her hands, resting on the worn wood of the table. "The town will talk," she said quietly. "Let them talk," he replied. "We've faced down worse than talk." She looked up and met his gaze, and a real, genuine smile lit up her face, chasing away the last of the shadows. "Yes," she said, "we have." Just then, the cabin door opened and Finn came in, his face flushed with the morning chill. He looked from Elias's serious face to his mother's smiling one, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. He walked over to the table, his expression uncharacteristically solemn. He had clearly been thinking, piecing together the fragments of adult conversation he wasn't meant to hear. "Mr. Boone?" he asked, his small voice full of a child's gravity. He looked at Elias directly. "Now that you're choosing us forever, can I call you Pa?" The simple question struck Elias with more force than a physical blow. It took the abstract future, the wedding, the legal papers, the arrangements, and made it breathtakingly real. This was the heart of it. Not a contract, not a shield, but this, a boy asking for a father, a family being born. Elias looked at Grace, whose eyes were shining with tears, and then he looked back at the boy. He reached out and placed a hand on Finn's small shoulder, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Yeah, son," he said, "I think you can." The fever burned itself out in the town, leaving behind a landscape of quiet grief and exhausted relief. When Sheriff Banks finally rode out to declare the quarantine lifted, the news was met not with celebration, but with a deep, collective sigh. For Elias and Grace, it meant the invisible wall around their 60 acres had crumbled. The world, with all its dangers, could now come visiting. They didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, a rider approached the cabin. It wasn't Maddox, but one of the men who had been with him that first day. He stopped his horse a respectable distance from the porch, where Elias was mending a buckle on a rein. "Boone," the man called out, his voice wary. He wouldn't look at Grace, who had come to stand in the doorway. "Maddox sent me. He says this business with the woman has gone on long enough. He wants to parley. Settle things." "Settle what?" Elias asked, not looking up from his work, his voice dangerously calm. "The debt she owes," the rider said. "He's acting as an agent for the interested parties from back east. He wants to meet Creek's Bend 2 days from now. At noon, just you and her. He says to come reasonable, and you can all walk away clean." It was a lie wrapped in a threat. Creek's Bend was a secluded spot, a muddy cutbank thick with willows and reeds, a place where a man could disappear. Elias finished with the buckle, his movements slow and deliberate. "You tell Maddox we'll think on it," Elias said, finally looking up. His gaze was flat and cold. The rider, unnerved, didn't linger. He wheeled his horse and was gone. That night, they sat with Ada Mercer and Sheriff Banks in the lamplit kitchen. Finn was asleep, safely tucked away from the adult fears that filled the room. The air was thick with tension. "It's a trap," Banks said, his hand wrapped around a mug of coffee. "Plain and simple. He wants you out in the open, away from your land, where he thinks he can bully you without witnesses." "More than bully," Elias said grimly. "He wants to finish this." "He doesn't know the whole story," Grace said, her voice quiet but firm. She looked at the three of them, her gaze steady. "He doesn't know what I know." She then explained something she had only told Elias the night before, when the men from Indiana had first been described by the sheriff. A cold dread had settled on her. The name of their supposed employer was the same as a man she had recorded payments for in her railroad ledger, a man named Jasper Cole, a land speculator with a reputation for ruthless dealings. Clay Maddox, she now realized, wasn't just a ranch foreman. His name, too, was in her memory, connected to transactions that were less about cattle and more about acquiring land and water rights through intimidation and creative accounting. She had spent the last few weeks, in the quiet evenings, painstakingly recreating a section of that ledger from memory into a small notebook. It wasn't the original, but her hand was the same, her memory for figures exact. "It's the Barlow place," she said, her finger tapping the table. "It's not about my husband's debt. That's just the excuse, the lever. The old Barlow homestead has the strongest spring in this whole valley. It feeds Creek's Bend. Whoever controls that spring controls the water for the South Range, especially in a dry year. Maddox, or this Jasper Cole he works for, wants it." Ada looked at her, her eyes sharp with appreciation. "And your ledger connects Maddox to Cole's other acquisitions." "It shows a pattern," Grace confirmed. Payments made for services right before small homesteaders were suddenly convinced to sell their land to Cole's holding company for pennies on the dollar. A plan began to form, not of violence, but of law. a trap to catch a trapper. He expects 2 people, Banks said, a shrewd light in his eyes. He expects fear. We won't give him that. He looked at Elias. You know the Svensson brothers, Lars and Olaf. They filed a complaint against Maddox last year for damming up a creek that watered their pasture. The complaint went nowhere, but they haven't forgotten. They're honest men, and they're not afraid of a fight. They'd make for fine witnesses. They would. Elias agreed. The Svenssons were large, quiet Swedes who kept to themselves but were known to be as solid as the rock they farmed. The plan was set. Elias and Grace would go to the meeting as requested, but Banks, Ada, and the 2 Svensson brothers would be there first, concealed in the thick reeds on the far side of the creek. They would not be there to start a fight, but to witness one. Justice on the frontier needed more than just a badge. It needed the eyes and ears of the community. The 2 days leading up to the meeting were taut with a silent, nervous energy. Elias cleaned his rifle and his Colt, his movements methodical. He saw Grace watching him, her face pale. He was not a gunslinger, and they both knew it. He was a farmer, a man who built things, who nurtured life from the soil. But he would do what he had to do to protect his own. He was no longer just a man surviving. He was a man defending his future, a future that now had a name and a face and a small boy who called him Pa. On the appointed day, they rode toward Creek's Bend. Grace rode Buck, her back straight, the small, damning notebook tied securely in an oilcloth packet in her saddlebag. Elias was on his plow horse, a slower but immensely steady animal. He didn't want to look like he was riding into a fight. He wanted to look like a man coming to talk. The air at the bend was thick and humid, smelling of mud and decaying leaves. Reeds grew in a dense wall along the sluggishly moving water. It was a perfect place for an ambush. As they reined in, Maddox and his 4 men emerged from a stand of cottonwoods. They spread out, a clear and deliberate act of intimidation. Right on time, Maddox sneered, his confidence blooming in the isolated setting. I like a man who's punctual. We're here, Maddox, Elias said, his hands in plain sight on his reins. What's this about? It's about the debt, Maddox said, pulling a folded, official-looking document from his coat. A legal note, signed by one John Hartley. You harbor his widow. You harbor his debt. The law is clear. My employers want what's owed. Or suitable compensation. He gestured vaguely toward the Barlow cabin, visible in the distance. That paper isn't worth the ink on it, and you know it, Elias said. Maddox's pretense of civility vanished. It's worth whatever I say it's worth, he snarled. He took a step forward, his hand dropping to rest on the butt of his pistol. You've been a thorn in my side since you got here. Woman, and you, Boone, you were happy enough to be left alone until you decided to play the hero. This is your last chance. Sign over any claim to the Barlow place, and we ride away. Refuse, and things are going to get complicated. 2 of his men began to move, trying to circle around them. It was the moment. I don't think so, Maddox, Elias said, his voice ringing with a new authority. At that signal, Sheriff Banks and the 2 towering Svensson brothers rose from the reeds on the far bank, rifles held at the ready. Ada Mercer stood with them, her presence as a witness lending a different kind of authority. Maddox froze, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He had been played. Banks, this is a private matter. Doesn't look private to me, the sheriff called across the water, his voice booming in the quiet clearing. Looks like 5 armed men threatening a citizen. Looks like intimidation. Cornered and furious, Maddox made his mistake. He lunged, not for his gun, but for Grace's bridle, trying to drag her from her horse. You! He screamed, his face contorted with rage. Elias moved instantly, his body a blur as he threw himself off his horse and slammed into Maddox, driving him back. One of Maddox's men, seeing the fight begin, drew his pistol. A single deafening shot cracked the air not from the henchman, but from the reeds. the man cried out, dropping his gun and clutching his arm, where a dark red stain was already spreading on his sleeve. It was a disabling shot, not a killing one, fired by the steady hand of Lars Svensson. The fight was over before it began. The other men froze, their hands raised high as Banks and the Svenssons waded across the shallow creek, their rifles leveled. But the confrontation wasn't finished. Grace slid down from Buck's back. She walked calmly toward the sputtering, furious Maddox, who was being held by Elias. She pulled the oilcloth packet from her saddlebag and untied it, revealing the small notebook. She was no longer a victim. Her fear had been burned away, replaced by a cold, righteous anger. "This isn't about my husband, Clay," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It's about this." She opened the notebook. "It's about the $500 Jasper Cole paid you in '76, the week before the widow O'Malley's well mysteriously went foul. It's about the fencing supplies you were paid for right after the Svensson's Creek was dammed. It's about a dozen other dirty little deals, a pattern of threats and bribes all designed to drive honest people off their land and into the hands of your boss." She read another entry, a date and a sum of money, and Maddox's face went white. This was a weapon he had never anticipated. Not a gun, but memory, truth, written down in black and white. "That's a lie of fabrication," he blustered, but his eyes were darting around, looking for an escape that wasn't there. "Is it?" Banks said, snapping a pair of handcuffs onto Maddox's wrists. "We'll let a judge in the county seat decide that. This notebook will make for some mighty interesting reading." The sheriff looked at Maddox, his face hard. "Attempted coercion, assault. You're in a world of trouble, son." As he was being pulled away, Maddox shot a venomous look at Grace. "You think this is over? You have no idea who you're messing with. Cole will crush you." Sheriff Banks led a sputtering Maddox and his sullen, disarmed men away. The Svensson brothers gave Elias a solemn nod before heading back to their farm. Ada came over, a small, triumphant smile on her face. "Justice, it seems, sometimes just needs good bookkeeping," she said to Grace. Elias and Grace stood alone in the quiet clearing. The muddy, ugly business was done. He looked at her, at the woman who had faced down her past and turned her greatest weakness, her memory of a life of debt and fear, into her greatest strength. He hadn't rescued a damsel in distress. He had stood beside his partner, his equal, as she fought her own battle. They were no longer just surviving the rules of the frontier. They were starting to write their own. The dust from the confrontation at Creek's Bend settled, and in its place, a profound quiet took root. The land, which had been a backdrop for fear and survival, now seemed to breathe a sigh of relief alongside them. Summer arrived, and with it, the corn in the bottomland grew thick and green. The potato blossoms opened in a field of small, white stars, and the garden by the cabin door thrived under Grace's patient hands. The world had returned to the simple, honest work of living. They chose a Sunday in late June for the wedding. There was no church, no fine clothes, just the vast, blue bowl of the prairie sky for a cathedral ceiling. Reverend Reeves, a traveling minister with a kind, weathered face and a Bible worn soft as leather, agreed to perform the ceremony. Their witnesses were the Svensson brothers, Lars and Olaf, who arrived looking scrubbed and solemn in their Sunday best, their massive hands holding their hats awkwardly against their chests. Ada Mercer came, too, her presence a quiet affirmation of their journey. Finn was the ring-bearer. He wore a clean, mended shirt, and a path had been wetted and combed through his unruly hair. In his small, trembling hands, he carried two simple, unadorned bands of gold that Elias had traded for in town. He stood between Elias and Grace, his face a study in childish gravity, a small, essential link in the new chain they were forging. The vows weren't flowery. Reverend Reeves spoke of companionship in a hard land, of the comfort of a shared fire against the winter wind, of the blessing of a family chosen by the heart. When it was his turn, Elias looked at Grace, not the fugitive, Not the survivor, but the woman who had brought light back into his silent house. "I will stand with you," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he didn't try to hide. "I will be your home." When Grace spoke, her voice was clear and steady, carrying on the gentle breeze. "I was lost," she said, her eyes locked with his. "And you showed me a place to stand. I will build my life here, with you." Elias slid the ring onto her finger, his calloused thumb brushing against her skin. She did the same for him, her touch warm and sure. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, a slow smile spread across Elias's face, a genuine, unguarded expression of peace that Grace had never seen before. Finn, seeing their hands joined, let out a small, happy whoop, breaking the solemnity and making everyone laugh. They shared a simple meal of roasted chicken and fresh dug potatoes under the shade of the cottonwood tree. And for the first time, Elias felt not the ghost of a past happiness, but the solid, warm reality of a present one. Later that week, as the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, Elias took her hand. "There's a place I need to show you," he said. Finn walked between them, holding both their hands. As they made their way up the gentle slope of the hill behind the cabin, the wind was stronger up here, a constant, clean presence that rustled the tall prairie grass. At the crest of the hill, under a lone, gnarled oak, were two simple wooden crosses. Sarah Boone, Daniel Boone. The names were carved deep, weathered by a year of sun and snow. Elias stood before the graves, his hat in his hands. The pain of his loss was still there, a familiar scar on his soul, but the raw, gaping wound had closed. He was no longer defined solely by their absence. He had stood here 1,000 times in his grief, a man talking to ghosts. Now, he stood here with a new family, a man embracing the future. Grace had gathered a small handful of wild prairie roses on their way up the hill. She knelt and gently laid the small, fragrant bouquet at the base of Sarah's cross. She stayed there for a moment, her head bowed. Finn watched her, his expression somber, understanding this was a sacred place. Elias heard Grace whisper. The words meant only for the wind and the woman who rested beneath the sod. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft and full of a profound, womanly empathy. "Thank you for the good man you left behind." She rose and came to stand beside Elias, slipping her hand into his. He squeezed it, a silent acknowledgement of her grace, of her understanding that love is not a finite resource, that a new life doesn't erase the one that came before. It simply makes the story longer, richer. They stood there for a long time, the three of them, a bridge between the past and the future, while the wind sang its endless ancient song over the waving grass. A few weeks later, Sheriff Banks brought the final news. Clay Maddox had been tried and sentenced by a territorial judge, his testimony implicating the powerful Jasper Cole. With the evidence from Grace's notebook and the sworn statements of the Svensons and other homesteaders, federal marshals were now investigating Cole's vast, questionably acquired land holdings. "He won't be bothering this valley again," Banks had said with grim satisfaction. Ada, who had ridden out with the sheriff, just shook her head and smiled. "The country heroes," she said, looking from Grace to Elias, "won the day with a ledger book and common sense. It might just catch on." The fear was gone. The whispers and sidelong glances in town had transformed into nods of respect. They were no longer the widower and the squatter. They were the Boones, a family who had stood their ground and demanded justice. The house filled with the sounds of life. Finn's laughter echoed in the yard as he chased butterflies. In the evenings, the quiet whir of a spinning wheel filled the cabin as Grace worked with the wool from Elias's few sheep, her hands never idle. Finn now called Elias Pa as easily as breathing. The word a constant, gentle reminder of the miracle that had taken root in their lives. The boy, who had been old before his time, was finally just a boy, secure in the knowledge that he was home, and that home was a safe and permanent thing.
One crisp autumn evening, a letter arrived from Ada. Elias watched as Grace read it by the light of the fire, her brow furrowed in concentration. A slow smile spread across her face. "What is it?" he asked. "It's Ada," she said, looking up at him, her eyes shining with a new idea. "She says, with my clear hand and my head for figures, she thinks the homesteaders in the valley would pay to have their children taught to read and write. She thinks I should start a school." Elias looked at his wife. He saw the woman who had run from a shadowed past, who had fought for her son, who had stood beside him as an equal. Now, he saw a new future opening for her, one she would build with her own unique gifts. A future not just as a wife and mother, but as a teacher, a cornerstone of the very community she had once hidden from. Hope, he knew, wasn't a loud, dramatic thing. It was quiet and enduring, like the steady flame in their hearth, like the strong, simple thread she used to mend a working man's shirt. It was the promise of a peaceful harvest, year after year. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment below where you're listening from so we can all connect. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night. Like this video. And press the hype button to help share this story with more listeners.